All right, hi. My name is Will Martin. I'm really sorry I can't be with you all there in person. I was doing my best Bodie Mill impersonation on the ski hill in Lake Tahoe at the end of the season, and I got a really bad broken leg. So there's no way I'm going to be able to get on a plane, especially go to Orlando, and I'm really sad I can't talk to all of you. I was really looking forward to chatting with people after the presentation. But I'm going to leave my email at the end of the presentation, and hopefully if you are interested in the topic of peak oil, I certainly am. I'd like to talk with anybody has any questions or comments. You can just send me an email afterwards. So with that said, let's get started here. So today I'm going to be talking about peak oil, and the first thing I need to do is define the term peak oil. And peak oil it's about rates. It's not about production. It's reserves. It's about production rates. So really, peak oil is the point at which we reach a maximum rate in global oil production in millions of barrels per day. And peak oil can happen either because supply becomes constrained or because demand becomes constrained because demand tapers off due to demand destruction from higher oil prices, or if demand ramps down due to some ramp up of some other substitute. So you can have peak oil demand or peak oil supply. But because peak oil is a finite resource, or because oil is a finite resource, we eventually will reach peak oil. That's a fact that we know. But really it leads us to just two questions. First, when will we reach peak oil? And second, how bad will it be? How quickly will the rate of production decline after we reach the peak in oil production? And those are questions that no one can really answer because it's looking at the future. But a bunch of different energy agencies have tried to answer that question. Here's just one. This is from Energy Watch Group, which is an organization out of Germany that's been looking at the problem of peak oil for a while. They basically say we're reaching peak oil right now, and that we're going to get about a 4% annual decline rate afterwards. So this is one of the more pessimistic projections, and I'm going to be showing you some other projections later on in this presentation. So let's talk about the peak oil debate in general. The peak oil debate has been going on for about 50 years, and it's actually a sort of a subset of a larger philosophical debate surrounding the ability of mankind to sort of use our superior intellect and our engineering technologies to continuously save us from whatever resource shortage or resource ceiling we're running up against at any particular time. And on one side of the debate, you have what you can call the Malthusians or the Doomers, and these are people that would basically tell you the sky is falling all of the time. In the 1790s, this was Thomas Malthus who published his essay on the principles of population, basically saying that because population is growing so quickly that we'd all starve to death. He, of course, was proven wrong. In the 1960s and 70s, this was sort of the limits to growth crowd. It's Paul Ehrlich. He was on Johnny Carson quite a bit, talking about the population bomb, basically saying that overpopulation and peak oil and decline of resources would doom us to a world where we wouldn't have any economic growth at all. And then in the early 2000s, this was people like the hedge fund manager Matthew Simmons, who wrote Twilight in the Desert, basically telling us that we were about to reach peak oil right now. And then on the other side of the debate, you have what you can call the cornucopians or the Pollyannas. These are people that say, we should never worry about any of this stuff, that the free market will find a solution to any problem, and that technology will always save us, and that there's no reason even having this debate. And, this is usually economists that take this position. In the 1980s, it was the economist Julian Simon that took this position and famously wagered against Paul Ehrlich. Simon actually won that wager in 1990. In the 2000s, it was people like Leonardo Magiri and Daniel Yergin, who sort of famously took the side that peak oil is dead and there's nothing we need to worry about. And you can see, depending on the decade, either side is sort of winning. In the 1960s, things were great, and we had oil production booming and food production booming and brought billions of more people onto the planet. In the 1970s, we had oil shocks, and Jimmy Carter was on TV wearing a sweater telling us all to turn down our thermostats. and start getting ready to live in a world that had less energy. And then right after that, in the 1980s, we had Ronald Reagan. He ripped the solar panels that Jimmy Carter put on the roof of the White House right off, and told us to get ready for morning in America, that everything was going to be great. And in the 1990s, everybody bought an SUV. And then in the 2000s, the oil price, spiked up to $147 a barrel, and all of a sudden the debate swung completely in the other direction. So in the early 2000s, that's what we saw. We saw the debate swing. We saw dozens of books published on peak oil. Prices of oil skyrocketed right before the worst recession since the Great Depression. And really, it seemed like we were at peak oil imminently, in that we were about to see a terrible decline in global oil production. But then the 2010s came around. We got out of the recession. And the peak oil debate basically did a complete 180. During the last presidential cycle, we had basically both sides telling us that America would be energy independent, and that this huge boom in oil production meant that we never had to worry about peak oil. People famously declared peak oil is dead. And so right now, no one in the mainstream is really talking about peak oil. It's kind of interesting how far the pendulum swung and how quickly it swung. So why did the debate flip so quickly? It comes down to the fact that the United States oil production has increased significantly. We reversed our post-peak decline, and it's come up significantly in the last few years. So why is this? In a word, it's fracking. We brought on a tremendous amount of oil from places like North Dakota in the last few years, and basically oil production from these regions has increased at an exponential rate. So we've really turned a corner in the last few years. And it's not just oil. We've seen rising gas production from fracking. And so in the early 2000s, we were so worried about gas shortages in the U.S. that we were actually building liquefied natural gas import terminals. And now we have so much gas that these companies that build the terminals are trying to turn them into gas export terminals, so we can actually export all this LNG. So we've seen tremendous increases in natural gas production as well in the U.S. But of course, nothing lasts forever, and here's the official forecast of tight gas production from the United States Department of Energy's Energy Information Agency, the EIA. And based on their best guess, we will see a peak in tight gas production around 2020. And, just to take a step back, we have to consider the fact that these are official government forecasts, and they're actually not usually that accurate. When we look at the EIA forecast for oil production, we see that they are wrong on average about 11%, by about 11% every year. And, taking a step back, we also need to ask ourselves, how important is this increase in U.S. production? And simply put, it's not that big of a deal. It's not as big of a deal as everybody seems to be making it out to be. The U.S. produces just 10% of the world's oil. We hold just 2% of the world's oil reserves. And, while production is up in the U.S., what really matters is what happens to the production of oil exporting countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia. So you're going to hear a lot of buzz about fracking, mostly because it's done by publicly traded companies, and they have a pretty large megaphone on places like Bloomberg and CNBC. But when you have publicly traded oil companies, they only produce a quarter of the world's oil. So what really matters is what's happening to the national oil companies like Saudi Aramco and ADNOC, in Abu Dhabi. So when you take a step back, what really matters is what's happening to these big national oil companies and big oil exporting nations. And I'll walk you through in a little bit what's happening to them, but the picture is not nearly as rosy as what's happening in the U.S. And this sort of leads to what I'd call debate myopia, that it's sort of short-sighted of people to just look at shale oil production as the only important factor that's going on here. But what's really going on is, there's a lot happening in the global oil world. On one side you have increased production from fracking, but then on the other side you have declining base production of conventional oil. On the debate side, you have, in the developed world, you have sort of declining demand as the population ages. And then in the developing world, you have a huge boom in demand as people get wealthier and as population increases. On the supply side, you have a lot of things that are increasing your supply. You have increasing discoveries. Although, unfortunately, world oil field discoveries peaked in 1965, and since 1980 we've actually consumed more oil each year than we've found. So this isn't really increasing supply as much as we'd like. We have technological improvements like fracking, obviously bring on new supply. Anytime we have increased capital spending, the more you spend drilling, the more oil you're going to get out of the ground. But then meanwhile, you have a lot of things decreasing the supply of oil. You have base decline from post-peaked fields. You have increasing regulations in some areas. We're seeing fracking bans in some countries. Political instability and wars can obviously take production offline, as we're seeing right now in Libya and parts of Iraq. Natural disasters like hurricanes can take supply temporarily offline. And then when oil companies decide to cut back on capital spending, especially when big national oil companies do this, we see decreasing supply. On the demand side, again, we have population growth, rising wealth, increasing demand. And then on decreasing demand in much of the developed world, we have an aging population. We have pretty high unemployment still. We have increasing efficiency standards for our vehicles, like the CAFE standards, people buying hybrid cars, people substituting entirely for oil by buying electric cars, and we see public transit usage increasing dramatically in the developed world. In the future, we could see much higher carbon taxes, which would obviously increase prices and decrease demand. And then we could also see decline. We are seeing right now declining energy intensity in much of the world, and countries getting rid of their energy subsidies, which obviously decrease demand over time. So one way to it's a pretty murky picture looking at all these things pulling oil in different directions, and one way to sort of simplify all this is to look at just a simple supply and demand curve. So here's your basic Econ 101 supply and demand curve. This one is showing demand increasing, which is raising the price of whatever commodity we're looking at. So what is the actual oil supply and demand curves? What do they really look like in the real world? Well, this is the closest we can get to what we see as the actual oil supply and demand curves. The supply curve on the left is represented by what we call the marginal cost curve. And there's essentially a dozen different categories of oil out there, and each has a different marginal cost and a different available quantity supplied at different prices. And this is sort of the current best estimate of our current marginal cost curve from the International Energy Agency in Paris. And if you look at this chart, we're currently producing a lot of heavy oil bitumen, which is essentially Canadian tar sands. And let's say demand shifts to the right, well then we'd start producing more oil shales and the price would increase slightly. Now the really interesting thing is that these boxes don't stand still over time, they move around. They shrink and expand. You see the yellow MENA conventional, which is Middle East North Africa conventional oil box. That will likely continue to shrink on the x-axis and expand on the y-axis as base decline brings these post-peak megafields down in production, rising prices there, rising costs. The blue oil shales box could easily expand on the x-axis as new places like Poland and China bring on increasing fracking production. And as technology gets better, that box could move down on the y-axis. The chart on the right is essentially the demand curve. This is the actual demand for gasoline in the U.S. And if you tried to fit a line to this, it would basically be a totally vertical line. And this is because demand for gasoline, and sort of by extension demand for crude oil, is almost perfectly inelastic. And so this is mostly because oil is perhaps the most important commodity for the healthy functioning of our global economy. We just see that the demand line is almost perfectly vertical. So what's really going to happen here is, as the supply changes, as this curve shifts around, as the boxes move and shrink and expand, that's what's really going to cause us to see peak oil in the future, and it could be as a result of demand, as I'll talk about in the future. So let's look at each one of these boxes one by one. We'll sort of look at them and see how they're going to likely change in the future, and hopefully this will give everybody a better picture of what the future supply curve looks like. First, we have the production from conventional Middle East, North Africa oil. And this box is largely dependent on what's called the fiscal break-even cost curve. And this is looking at, these national oil companies in these countries are essentially treated like the personal bank accounts of the kings and oil sheiks of these nations, and they use the revenue from these companies to make their people's lives better. Basically, they use it to build hospitals and schools, and they've promised hospitals and schools and the world's tallest buildings and all kinds of things to their people, and all that costs money. So this curve basically shows us if oil prices drop below a certain point, the promises made by these countries won't be able to be met. And so what happens is, if these fiscal break-evens aren't met, these countries will basically have a huge incentive to cheat on their OPEC quotas and keep production up as much as possible. And what happens is this fiscal break-even cost curve essentially gives us a cost floor at the very bottom of the marginal cost curve for crude oil in general. And then at the same time, looking at how this box is going to change over time, we're seeing that the Middle East is seeing massive base decline. Most of the world's mega fields are in the Middle East, and according to the International Energy Agency, the world's giant oil fields, which account for about a third of the global oil supply, have likely all peaked. And the combined output of just the 10 largest supergiant megafields has likely already fallen about 30%, and this decline is likely irreversible. So this yellow block over time is going to shrink on the x-axis and probably rise on the y-axis as prices and costs of producing this oil continues to go up. Other conventional oil I would include in this essentially shallow water, Gulf of Mexico, as well as just conventional oil drilling on land around the world. We're seeing very high base decline rates for a lot of conventional oil. Gulf of Mexico and North Sea, we're seeing 10 to 20% annual base decline rates, which means you need to keep drilling and doing enhanced oil recovery to keep your production rates up. And it's just very difficult to keep this box from sort of shrinking on the x-axis. So over time, this box will also continue to shrink on the x-axis. You see on the bottom left, this is the U.S. Real cost per crude oil per well drilled, and it's essentially gone exponential since about 2005. It's just going to be very difficult to keep costs down here, and over time we're going to probably see this box shrink and rise on the y-axis. Enhanced oil recovery, this can include steam injection on fields, water injection, CO2 injection. The picture on the left here is actually water injection wells in Gwar, which is the world's largest mega field in Saudi Arabia. And they're doing a lot of water injection right now to keep the production rate up in the field. Essentially, this allows you to keep conventional oil fields from keep having their base decline rate affect overall production rate a whole lot. But over time, there's only so much this can do, and it's likely to get more and more expensive over time. On a bit of sort of an ironic note, if we put in a global carbon tax, it will actually encourage companies to inject CO2 into the ground and get more oil out of the ground. So a global carbon tax could actually increase the size of this box here. But over time, I think this box may shrink in size on the x-axis and increase on the y-axis. Looking at the next box, which is Arctic and Deepwater, I'm sort of combining these two. What we see is that deepwater drilling is extremely expensive. It's one of the most expensive endeavors on Earth, actually, outside of maybe space exploration. And every year it seems to get more expensive. Day rates for offshore drilling rigs routinely top $500,000 per day. Meanwhile, we're seeing offshore oil fields, the fields that we are finding in places like Brazil are typically in deeper and deeper water, and they're deeper and deeper in drilling ground. So it's just getting more and more expensive to essentially drill deep water in Arctic. Arctic didn't get off to a very promising start. Shell tried to go after Arctic starting in 2008. They spent about $5 billion. And they got zero return on investment after their rig, the Kulloch, ran aground in Alaska. So that wasn't very promising, and it certainly didn't help the mood inside the oil industry to make people very gung-ho about going after Arctic oil. There are resource opportunities here, but it looks like they're getting more and more expensive over time. Tar sands are very interesting. They hold a huge potential for increasing oil supply. There's vast quantities of tar sands in Canada, and every year we get better at extracting them. And most of us know about the sort of traditional mining of tar sands, which basically looks like a strip mine. You sort of cut down the forest and strip off the overburden, the earth above the bitumen, and then you sort of mine it as you would, coal or any other type of strip mine. But there are other ways of getting essentially tar sands out of the ground, and one of them is called SAGD. This is steam-assisted gravity drainage, and it's basically where you drill two wells, you inject steam into the top well, and the oil sort of drips down into the bottom well, and then you can pump it out. And this is fantastic from sort of an environmental standpoint, because it means that you don't have to cut down pristine forest, you don't have to run heavy trucks, and it actually, when you look at it, it seems like it might greatly lower the cost of extraction of heavy oil. So over time, this block could remain still, or it could actually shrink on the y-axis and potentially even expand a little bit on the x-axis. So this is an interesting one. It's the one real big wild card here is sort of carbon regulations. Tar sands are extremely energy intensive, and they have a very high greenhouse gas intensity. And if we see a global carbon agreement, it would likely greatly increase the cost of tar sands extraction, pushing this box up by quite a bit. Tight oil, this is what we've been talking about. This is fracking. This has allowed us to extract amazing rates of production out of our shale oil in the United States. And as we've gotten better at doing it, the costs have come down, so this block has actually moved down the y-axis in the last few years. As more and more countries come online and start fracking, like China is definitely trying this right now. We could see this in Poland, Russia even. It's going to bring on shale production and likely expand this box on the x-axis. The one caveat I'd put with this is that the decline rates are extremely high for tight oil. And you start drilling in sort of the sweet spots first, so this is the wells with the highest initial production rates. And then as you move down the line, you get to worse and worse wells with lower initial production rates, and you have to drill more and more and more to keep your production from, you want your production to keep going up, so you have to keep drilling more and more and more. And this gets you on what's called the fracking treadmill, where you basically have to keep drilling at an exponential rate just to increase your oil production at a linear rate. And eventually you're just going to reach limits of what you can do. You're going to reach limits of capital, limits of people, limits of water, many other limits in what you can do with tight oil. So I would say that we're probably going to see many of these regions peak rather quickly, and some of them might not hold the promise that maybe have been broadcast in the media as having a huge amount of promise, but it's definitely true that we've brought in a tremendous amount of oil online in the last few years from oil shale. The next box is gas to liquids. And this is basically a process where you take natural gas and run it through a Fischer-Tropsch process to get synthetic crude out the other end. So far, the best example we have for this is the Qatar Pearl project. And this project it took a lot longer than expected to get online, and it went about $10 billion over budget. And everything, once it was done, the cost per flowing barrel was about $130,000, which is much higher than any other oil production project on Earth. So it's very, very expensive, and that's, I think, put off a lot of companies from putting more of these kind of projects online. There's also the problem with just extremely high greenhouse gas emissions from this type of production. It's extremely energy intensive, and if we see any kind of global carbon agreement, it'll likely greatly increase the y-axis cost of this. So it already has a very high cost and could likely increase in the future. Cold liquids. The Nazis actually invented a way of getting synthetic crude oil out of coal back in World War II, and there's projects right now in Mongolia and China to get crude oil out of their vast coal reserves that they have. But sort of behind, again, besides the extremely high cost of doing this, there's the greenhouse gas intensity. And this is, again, if there's going to be any kind of carbon regulation globally, it's going to make cold liquids extremely unprofitable or extremely expensive to do. So this will likely continue to increase on the y-axis. And then we sort of move up the cost curve into the renewable portion of the curve. First is biomass-to-liquids, and this is essentially running biomass through a traditional oil refinery. In the future, you might hear about something called HDRD, which is hydrogeneration-derived renewable diesel. And essentially, it's a process where you can just take biomass and run it through a refinery, sort of like you would with just conventional crude oil, and then you get a very high-quality synthetic oil or synthetic product out of the other end. But overall, this process is still extremely expensive. The one nice thing about BTL, biomass to liquids, is that it doesn't directly compete with the food supply. You can use inputs that aren't actually food. Moving up the cost curve, though, we do get into that food versus fuel problem. The next is ethanol. We get most of our corn, most of our ethanol right now from corn in the United States. Essentially, the process is fermentation and distillation, the same way you'd make whiskey. And the problem is that this competes directly with our food supply. You're essentially filling up your tank with food. And we've seen that as food prices have risen, so too have ethanol prices. Over the last few years, ethanol prices have gone up quite a bit in the U.S. So the y-axis, this box has definitely increased and gotten higher. And finally, it's biodiesel. Again, similarly with ethanol, this competes against our food supply. It's one of the most expensive forms of liquid fuel. So across the supply curve, all the way up that marginal curve, we're seeing technological improvements, and any one of these technological improvements can, lower the y-axis costs of these boxes over time. This is sort of a short list I put together of technological improvements we're seeing right now, but there are things that are going to push down the marginal cost curve over time. Perhaps the most important factor, though, of global oil supply is the amount of money spent on extraction. And simply put, if you spend more money drilling for oil, you're going to get more oil. The problem is, for oil companies, that you want to turn a profit. So the spending must meet some kind of threshold for return. And the return on investment is dependent on keeping the project on time and on budget. And so this means that when you get rising labor costs or day rates increasing, it eats into your profit and makes the thresholds harder to meet. So this is what's very important here is the cost of capital. And many times projects are done on borrowed money. Right now what we're seeing is corporate bond rates are about as cheap as they've been for a very long time. So it's cheap to drill for oil on borrowed money right now, which is what we're seeing with a lot of the fracking projects. But people generally agree that these corporate bond rates are about as low as they're going to get, and they can really only go one direction from here, which is up. So the cost of borrowing will likely go up. It will likely raise the economic threshold for drilling, and that could take a lot of these projects offline in the future, which would decrease supply. Project profitability is also extremely, the price of oil is extremely important for project profitability. And what we've seen is the price of oil has been essentially flat for 4 years. What's really interesting is that Wall Street, the futures market, is in backwardation right now, which essentially means that Wall Street thinks that the price of crude oil is going to drop in the future. If it does, that would hurt capital spending. It would bring projects that were about to be approved offline because the economics would look worse. And also right now we're seeing some major discounts, price discounts, due to the lack of available pipeline capacity. So, think Keystone XL. Depending on where you're producing oil, it can be hard to get product to market, and that can actually lower the price that you're getting for that product, which lowers the overall profitability, and that lowers the amount of capital spending, and that lowers the amount of supply that we get out of some of these regions. So this is one of the most important things, capital spending, that's going on and affecting supply right now. Overall, we see that total Supermajor capital spending is projected to increase over time. This is a chart from Barclays Capital, which does bode well for increasing oil supply over time. But on the other hand, what you see is that the amount of total oil production you get for every dollar you spend has also risen over time. So what you see on this chart is basically we've had a 400% increase in Capex and then only gotten a 35% increase in daily production out of that Capex. So this huge increase in Capex spend might not actually result in a huge increase in oil production as people might expect. This is just another way of looking at it. We see that Capex spending is increasing faster than crude oil production. When you put them together on the right, you see that Capex per barrel produced has been rising since the 1980s and has gone nearly vertical since 2005. So yes, we are, as an industry, increasing Capex spend, but whether or not that translates into hugely increased amounts of production, that remains to be seen. Again, drilling costs continue to go up. Interest rates are at zero essentially right now due to the Fed's quantitative easing and zero interest rate policy. So it really has nowhere to go but up, which means that the cost of lending goes up. There's also the issue of labor costs, and right now we're in the middle of what the industry is calling the Great Crew Change. This is essentially the fact that a lot of very experienced engineers and drillers are on the verge of retirement, and the industry is sort of struggling right now to hire enough young people to sort of train up and replace these retiring workers right now. So we could definitely see labor rates go up in the future. And we've definitely seen day rates go up in the last decade. Now moving to the demand side, we see this is, when you look at the median estimate from the United Nations of what world population looks like, it's going to increase over time. If you look at the high estimate, it could continue at its pace and just keep right on increasing at billions and billions of people. And for the past century, population has exploded. So, when you sort of look at crude oil production, which has also exploded, when you sort of combine these two, what's really interesting is that the crude oil production per capita has been completely flat since the 1980s. So even if we don't see peak oil soon, we might see peak oil per capita, which would be very interesting. Global wealth is rising. Wealth and oil consumed are almost perfectly correlated, and the OECD expects global wealth to just continue increasing in the future, meaning that global oil demand will likely continue to increase as well. What's interesting on the other side of the demand equation is essentially that you have aging demographics in a lot of the developed world. So in Europe, you can see an aging population. Japan, definitely an aging population. What's interesting is the chart on the right, which is how much you drive depending on what stage of your life you're in. And you see once people pass 55 years old, they start driving quite a bit less. And this is obviously because their children are grown up, so they're not driving their kids to soccer practice. It's also, you're reaching retirement, so you're not commuting to work every day. And as all of these countries sort of age and move more and more people into those later brackets that use less and less, drive less and use less energy, we could see continued decline in demand in the developed world. Looking back on the chart on the left, on the very bottom, you see Nigeria. And so what's really interesting is in countries like Nigeria, the developing world, population is increasing, and over the next century they're going to move from having a population that doesn't demand much to having a population that's sort of in the 30-year-old age bracket that demands a lot, that's going to be driving to work and commuting to work and hopefully developed and demanding a lot of oil. We're also seeing definitely increasing demand for electric cars. Electric car adoption has increased dramatically. I live in the Bay Area, and I definitely see a lot of Teslas around, and I definitely know a lot of people that want to buy a Tesla. And in the future, I think electric cars will continue to take a bigger chunk out of demand for crude oil in the developed world. We're also seeing economies, especially China, if you look at the right chart, using less and less oil per GDP produced. And this essentially means the world can get richer while using less oil. So this also means that over time demand could decrease. But looking a little bit deeper at the economic energy intensity, we can see that the developed world is becoming less intensive, but the developing world, places like the Arab world and Brazil, may actually get more energy intensive over time. So this is still a little bit of a murky picture as to what will happen as the developing world gets wealthier, whether or not this is going to greatly increase oil demand. Substitution is also taking off. Obviously, wind and solar aren't direct substitutes for crude oil. They don't provide liquid transportation fuel. But when you combine them with electric cars, renewable energy can decrease demand for oil, and we are seeing greatly increased supply of these renewable energy sources. You're also seeing a huge boom in mass transit demand. A lot of young people in the developed world are moving to cities and moving to walkable neighborhoods that have good public transportation, and they simply don't need a car anymore. A lot of people now have given up their car and have a Zip car membership and live in a place where they can take public transit to work. So public transit demand will continue to increase likely, and that will also likely to continue this trend of fewer people owning cars and demand decreasing in the developed world. Carbon tax and fuel subsidies. So on the demand side, both of these would decrease demand. If we see some kind of massive global carbon tax, it could greatly decrease demand for fuel as the price of fuel increases. And then at the same time, most countries that have subsidies for fuel right now are trying to get rid of them because they're economically dead weight loss. It doesn't make any sense to have them, but then it's also just really, really expensive for these countries to keep up these subsidies. So over time, we'll probably see fewer subsidies, and this will all decrease demand over time. In the U.S., we see that demand is very inelastic, and over time, what happens is we have seen a peak in vehicle miles traveled back in about 2005 or so. This, however, could reverse itself if we see unemployment dropping. But the trend could continue if people continue to move to walkable neighborhoods, to cities, and use public transit and drive less and own fewer cars and have Zip cars and all that kind of stuff, drive electric cars. So no one really knows what's going to happen with this demand over time. So what's really interesting is peak oil is traditionally talked about in terms of supply, that we're going to reach some kind of limit to supply, and that's going to cause oil to peak. The Economist recently did a piece where they talked about peak oil demand, And all of those things I was just talking about, especially in the developed world, that decreased demand could in the future essentially lead to peak oil demand, which would cause, this would be because of demand destruction. Oil prices go so high that people simply use less and change their lifestyle. So this is the economist's take. It's something that could certainly happen, is we could see peak oil demand instead of peak oil supply. These are some various, oil price forecasts. So what does the future hold? The forecasts are all over the place. We see various forecasts for various agencies, and if peak oil happens tomorrow, we could see prices even higher than the highest estimates here. So what does this mean for the adhesives and sealants industry? First, you will likely see demand destruction. Car companies, for example, could simply learn to live with fewer sealants and adhesives per car produced. Second, you might see increased substitution. So sustainable adhesives made from plants, may start to replace existing conventional adhesives made from petroleum products. And then you might see a culture shift happening as people become more concerned with the environment and more concerned with sustainability. This could manifest itself as sort of people demanding more sustainably built products, demanding cars that use fewer adhesives or fewer non-recyclable materials. It could also, manifest itself as people becoming more concerned with things like VOCs. I know my friends having babies right now are certainly concerned with VOCs when they're buying baby cribs and so forth. And this is something that could continue in our culture. We could continue to get increasing demand for sustainable sealants and adhesives. But then on the flip side, you could get increased demand as companies move to things like carbon fiber to try to lightweight their vehicles to increase miles per gallon, and that would require even more adhesives and sealants. So the way, my overall advice for the adhesive and sealants industry is that you treat this like you would any other disruptive trend that's going to happen in the future. You could treat it like climate change. You look at climate change, and it's a very serious issue with the potential for major impacts to your bottom line. And I would say the same thing of peak oil. Peak oil will happen at some point. We don't know when. We don't know how severe it will be. But it is an issue with the potential to hurt your bottom line. And it's something that you should essentially be creating real options for your company that allow you to prosper no matter what scenario comes about. Whether we reach peak oil today or in 15 or 20 years. If you do the R&D today to be able to use sustainable alternatives, then you're ready for it if it happens today, or you're ready if some kind of culture shift happens. So thank you for listening to me. These are some books I've read recently that I would highly recommend if you're thinking of something to read on your Kindle on the flight home. If you are thinking about how you can change your company to build real options and become more sustainable. These are from people that are in the industry, work in the business world, have experience actually dealing with these issues, which is why I like these books so much. I'd highly recommend any of these. And I'd also recommend that you go to my blog. My blog is peakoilproof.com. And if you want to email me any questions or comments, or just want to talk about peak oil, it's something I'm very, very interested in. My email is will@peakoilproof.com. So thank you all for listening. I hope to hear from you.